The courtroom was quiet except for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional rustle of clothing. Judge Thomas Calloway sat at the bench, his sharp gaze fixed on Regina Hayes. The sun filtered through the large windows of the courthouse, casting a golden light over the room, but it did little to soften the stern atmosphere that hung in the air. Regina, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the tension that filled the space. "Ms. Hayes," Judge Calloway's voice cut through the silence. "You are charged with a minor infraction regarding zoning laws in your neighborhood. You've been found in violation of city codes by not properly securing your property within the required boundaries. The fine for this is $500. Regina didn't flinch at the amount. Instead, she gave a small nod and stood silently, waiting for the judge to continue. The judge glanced at the paperwork in front of him before looking back at Regina. "I trust you understand the seriousness of this infraction," he continued, his tone even but firm. "These regulations are in place for a reason. I'm sure this is not your first experience with the legal system, Ms. Hayes. However, the law must be upheld, regardless of who stands before me." Regina's eyes met the judge's, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, an understanding, perhaps, before she spoke. "Your Honor, I understand the law and I respect it," she said, her voice calm and composed. "However, this fine seems excessive for a technical error that was promptly corrected. I've already addressed the issue and taken full responsibility for it. I ask that you reconsider the severity of the fine, given the circumstances." The judge paused, considering her words, but in the end, he shook his head. He was a man of principle, and his principle told him that no one should be above the law. The courtroom, silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, waited for his decision. "Your request for leniency is noted, but the fine stands," Judge Calloway stated firmly. "It is the duty of this court to ensure that the law is applied equally to all, regardless of one's standing or influence in the community." Regina didn't argue further. She had known this would be the outcome. With a nod, she turned and left the courtroom without another word. As the door clicked shut behind her, whispers began to stir among the onlookers. Some recognized her name, but many didn't know who she truly was. Few understood the weight of her work or the influence she wielded in reshaping legal policies that affected people far beyond this small town. And yet, as Regina stepped into the hallway, a seed of curiosity began to grow in Judge Calloway's mind. There was something about her that seemed different, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. What had she said again? "I understand the law, and I respect it." For the first time in a long while, the judge wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had missed something far more important than a technical violation. Judge Calloway's curiosity about Regina Hayes grew over the next few days. Her face lingered in his mind, but it wasn't until this clerk, Sarah, mentioned a detail that he began to connect the dots. Sarah had noticed the same name appear repeatedly in various legal reform discussions that she had been following online. Intrigued, Sarah dug deeper into Regina's background, pulling up articles, interviews, and press releases that painted a much more complicated picture than the one the judge had seen in the courtroom. Regina Hayes wasn't just a woman dealing with a zoning issue. She was an influential lawyer, a senior advisor within the Justice Department, and an architect of the most significant criminal justice reforms in recent memory. For years, she had quietly led efforts to rewrite policies that sought to eliminate racial bias in law enforcement practices, particularly in areas like sentencing disparities, police conduct, and prison reform. Her role had been instrumental in pushing for legislation that addressed systemic inequalities, and her name had become synonymous with positive change in the legal system. The more Sarah uncovered, the more Judge Calloway was taken aback. How had he, a judge deeply involved in the legal community, missed her name until now? Regina Hayes was not just another lawyer. She was someone whose efforts were literally shaping the future of the justice system, especially for marginalized communities. Her work had been quietly championed by advocacy groups and had even gained attention from federal legislators. What Sarah had found made the judge pause. He had found someone whose policy revisions were now central to the very systems he had been upholding in his courtroom for years. Conflicted, Judge Calloway reached for the thick file of court transcripts from the case, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of unease. He hadn't asked the right questions when Regina stood before him. He had been so focused on the technicalities of the zoning violation that he had failed to consider the larger context of who Regina was. Her calm, measured tone in court now seemed almost too composed, as if she had known all along that this moment would be little more than a blip in her long career of navigating far more complex challenges. It wasn't long before word spread through local news outlets. Regina's name was everywhere. This wasn't just a case of a woman fined for a zoning violation. It was an unexpected intersection between the legal system and the powerful reforms she had helped create. News outlets picked up on the irony that someone at the forefront of justice policy could face such a trivial charge, and soon enough, people began questioning why such a prominent figure in law had been treated like any other defendant. For the first time in his career, Judge Calloway wondered if the law he had worked so hard to uphold had blind spots, ones that had missed the bigger picture. His decision to fine Regina was becoming a symbol of something much larger, and as the reality of his actions sank in, the judge couldn't help but feel he had overlooked a much deeper story. Who was the woman he had fined, really? And what kind of impact had he just had on someone whose life's work was dedicated to changing the very system he had sworn to protect? As the days passed, Judge Calloway found himself haunted by his decision in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that he had doubts about his role or his duty. He'd always prided himself on his strict adherence to the law. But something about the case, something about Regina Hayes, gnawed at him. The calmness with which she had accepted the fine, her measured words, and the way she left the courtroom without so much as a protest. It all seemed to suggest there was much more to her than a simple legal violation. The more the judge tried to shake it off, the more he felt a growing sense of discomfort. Had he made a mistake? Was he missing something important? His decision to impose the fine on Regina, despite her clear responsibility for fixing the violation, now seemed out of step with the larger context of who she was. He had been so focused on the letter of the law, on ensuring there was no preferential treatment, that he had failed to take a moment to understand the bigger picture. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, scrolling through legal reports on his computer, he came across an article detailing some of Regina's work in the Justice Department. The title of the piece caught his attention. Regina Hayes, the woman leading the charge for racial justice in America's courts. He clicked on it immediately. The article described her work in shaping policies that addressed systemic issues within the legal system, such as racial profiling and sentencing disparities. Her contributions had led to national reforms, and she was widely recognized as one of the most influential legal minds in the country. Yet there she had been, standing in front of him just days ago, charged with something so trivial. As the article described her initiatives, Judge Calloway felt an unexpected sense of awe. She had not only fought for change within the system, but had also made it possible for the law to evolve in ways that reflected the principles of fairness and equity. The judge had always believed in the importance of fairness, but he now wondered, could fairness be something more than just the application of the law? Regina's story had sparked something within him, a feeling that his rigid interpretation of justice might be limiting the way he saw the world. His thoughts drifted to the small-town courtroom, where a seemingly minor decision had the potential to alter someone's life, and in this case, someone who had been instrumental in shaping the laws he followed so carefully. He stood up and paced around his office, wrestling with his thoughts. He had imposed the fine without considering the broader implications, without realizing that Regina was not just another citizen. She was a trailblazer in justice reform, someone whose work had shaped policies that affected thousands of lives, including those of people he sought every day in his courtroom. The unease in his gut grew. Was he part of a system that, despite its good intentions, was blind to the people it affected? Was he, in this small act of enforcing the law, inadvertently perpetuating the very inequalities that Regina had spent her career trying to fix. The more the judge thought about it, the more he felt an overwhelming need to make things right. But how? What could he possibly do to address the mistake he now felt was so glaring? As the days passed, the story of Regina Hayes' fine began to take on a life of its own. The local news outlets, initially focused on the incident as just another courtroom decision, soon realized there was more to the narrative than they had anticipated. The irony of the situation, the fine levied against someone who was helping reshape national policy, was too compelling to ignore. Stories began to surface, not just in local media, but across the state, with journalists digging deeper into who Regina was and what she had accomplished. At first, the press coverage was subtle. A few investigative reporters from the local paper started asking questions about the case, noting the strange coincidence that Regina Hayes, a prominent figure in justice reform, had been fined for a zoning violation. But as the story gained momentum, it quickly turned into something bigger. Articles highlighted her work on eliminating racial biases in the criminal justice system, her involvement in advocating for sentencing reform, and her efforts to ensure that communities of color received fair treatment from the legal system. The more the public learned about her, the more questions arose. Why had the judge imposed such a fine on someone whose work was aligned with making the very system he worked within more equitable? Regina's name began circulating across social media platforms, where many people, particularly those who had followed her career, were both puzzled and outraged by the fine. A hashtag started trending, #JusticeForRegina, and it quickly gained traction, drawing attention not just from locals but from across the country. Activists, legal professionals, and even politicians began to weigh in on the situation, some expressing disbelief that someone with Regina's credentials could be treated like any other defendant, while others questioned the fairness of the legal process itself. How could someone pushing for reform in the system be penalized by the very system she was trying to change? The judge, however, had remained quiet throughout the growing storm. He had been watching the news unfold, feeling a deepening sense of unease. At times, the overwhelming pressure of public opinion made him want to dismiss it all, telling himself that his decision was based on law, not public sentiment. But as the conversations about Regina's contributions to justice reform continued to grow louder, he found it harder to ignore the mounting criticism of his actions. He had not expected such widespread attention. What had begun as a minor courtroom decision had now turned into a full-blown debate about fairness, the role of the law, and whether the system truly applied equally to everyone. The day after the #JusticeForRegina trended, Judge Calloway sat in his office, staring at the television as an evening news program discussed the case. A legal expert spoke about the implications of the fine, emphasizing that Regina's work had been critical to shifting the national conversation on criminal justice. The expert also questioned whether the judge had taken her contributions into account before making his decision. As the segment ended, the camera zoomed in on Regina's image, a confident woman with a calm but resolute expression. The judge felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The public was now making connections he hadn't considered. In their eyes, Regina wasn't just a defendant. She was a person whose impact reached far beyond the small courtroom. The law, it seemed, had become secondary to the larger question of justice, and his role in the unfolding situation now seemed far more significant than he had originally imagined. And yet, despite the growing scrutiny, the judge could not shake the feeling that he was still missing something. Could there be more to Regina Hayes' story than he had first understood, or had he misjudged her from the beginning? The question lingered, and the answer felt more elusive than ever. A few days later, Judge Calloway sat at his desk, his hands clasped in front of him as he stared at his computer screen. The weight of his decision, and the growing public conversation surrounding it, had begun to feel like a constant pressure. He knew he needed to do something. His earlier doubts had evolved into a deeper sense of regret. He had imposed a fine on Regina Hayes without truly understanding who she was or the significance of her work. He had acted too quickly, too rigidly. Now, he needed to address it, not just for his own peace of mind, but to ensure that his actions were consistent with the values he had sworn to uphold. With a deep breath, Judge Calloway picked up the phone and dialed Regina's number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice calm, yet carrying a trace of surprise. "Miss Hayes, this is Judge Calloway," he began, his words measured. "I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time. I'd like to speak with you about the fine I issued in your case." Regina's pause was brief, but it was enough for the judge to wonder if she was hesitant to engage. When she spoke again, her voice remained composed. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm happy to discuss it. I've been reflecting on the decision I made, and I realize now that I may have overlooked important context. I'd like to meet with you in person, if you're open to it. I owe it to you to understand the full picture." There was another pause, this time longer. Regina could have easily declined, given the public nature of the situation. Instead, her response was measured, but not dismissive. "I appreciate you reaching out. I think it's important to have this conversation. Let's meet tomorrow afternoon." The following day, Regina arrived at the courthouse, her presence dignified as always. Judge Calloway greeted her at the door, leading her to his office. There was an unspoken tension in the air, but Regina's calm demeanor put him at ease. He gestured for her to sit. "I want to start by acknowledging that I didn't fully appreciate your role when I made my decision," he said, sitting across from her. "I can see now that my approach was too narrow, and it was wrong of me to impose that fine without understanding the broader picture." Regina nodded, her expression softening slightly, but she didn't interrupt. The judge's sincerity was apparent, and for the first time, he wasn't just a figure of authority in her life. He was a man grappling with the same legal system she had spent years trying to reform. "I understand the pressures of your position, Your Honor," Regina replied. "But I also want to make it clear that the legal system you're defending is the same one I'm working to change. It's important to recognize the balance between the law as it is and the law as it should be." There was a weight to her words, a quiet strength that seemed to linger in the room. Regina wasn't just speaking from a place of expertise. She was speaking from lived experience, from years of navigating a system that often didn't work for everyone equally. The judge listened intently, feeling a shift in his understanding. "I've been working to address those inequalities," Regina continued, "but the reality is, even well-intentioned people within the system sometimes perpetuate those disparities without even realizing it. I wasn't just a defendant to you, Your Honor. I was someone working to change the very system that brought me here." The judge sat back, absorbing her words. He had assumed his job was about enforcing the law impartially, but Regina had opened his eyes to the ways in which the law itself needed to evolve. For the first time, he realized that being a fair judge wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the stories behind the cases and the people in his courtroom. "I owe you an apology, Miss Hayes," the judge said quietly. "And I want you to know that I'll be taking steps to ensure that my future decisions reflect a broader understanding of justice." Regina's gaze softened, but she didn't offer immediate forgiveness. Instead, she nodded, appreciating the effort it took for the judge to confront his own assumptions. "We're all part of this system, Your Honor," she said, "but acknowledging its flaws is the first step toward change." The conversation ended, but it marked the beginning of a new understanding for both the judge and Regina. And though there were no immediate answers, there was a shared recognition that change, while difficult, was always possible. The following morning, the weight of the conversation between Judge Calloway and Regina Hayes settled heavily on his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about her words, about how she had calmly but firmly reminded him of the larger issues at play. He had spent so many years in the courtroom, believing that his role was to simply enforce the law, without considering the nuances and complexities of each case. Regina had shown him that true justice required more than just following procedures. It required understanding the stories, the lives, and the work of those who came before him. As the day wore on, the judge felt a growing sense of discomfort. The apology he had offered her was genuine, but he wondered if it was enough. Was an apology enough to make up for a decision that, in hindsight, now felt so out of step with the values he thought he upheld? He had known Regina Hayes only as a defendant in a courtroom, someone to be judged by the letter of the law. But after speaking with her, he realized he had missed the point entirely. Later that afternoon, Judge Calloway made a decision. It wasn't something he had to do. It was something he knew he should do. He called a press conference. As he stood at the podium, the weight of the situation hung in the air. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about something much larger. It was about accountability, fairness, and most importantly, the willingness to admit when you were wrong. "Good afternoon," the judge began, his voice calm but steady. "I've called this press conference to address a decision I made recently regarding Ms. Regina Hayes, a prominent legal reform advocate and lawyer. Upon further reflection, I realized that my ruling was short-sighted and failed to take into account the broader context of Ms. Hayes' contributions to justice reform." He paused, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of the moment. He had always prided himself on being an impartial judge, but now he understood that fairness wasn't about applying the law rigidly. It was about understanding its impact on those who were subjected to it. "When I fined Ms. Hayes, I did so without fully understanding the extent of her work, nor the principles she's advocating for. I did not consider the larger picture of how she has shaped policy in ways that will benefit countless individuals. In light of this, I'm here today to publicly apologize to Ms. Hayes for my decision. It was an error in judgment, and I want to make it right." The room was silent, save for the clicking of cameras. The judge's apology wasn't just a personal one. It was a recognition of how the legal system, at times, had been blind to the complexities of reform and justice. His words were a call for self-reflection, not just for him, but for everyone who worked within the system. "I understand that an apology alone may not be enough," he continued, "but I promise to do the work necessary to ensure that future decisions reflect a broader understanding of justice and fairness. I will also be reviewing my practices to make sure that every case is considered with the full understanding of its impact." As he finished, Judge Calloway felt a strange sense of relief. He knew that his words might not be enough to undo the public attention that had surrounded the case, but he also knew they were a first step in the right direction. Regina Hayes had been right to challenge him, not just as a defendant, but as someone committed to making the system better. The press conference ended, but the story of Regina's fine and the judge's subsequent apology wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as Judge Calloway left the podium, he couldn't help but wonder how much more he would learn about Regina, about justice, and about himself. The press conference was a turning point. When Judge Calloway publicly apologized, the ripple effect was immediate. News outlets picked up on the story, praising the judge for his humility and willingness to admit his mistake. Some commentators called it a bold and rare move for a public figure, while others questioned whether the apology was enough to make up for the damage done. But no one doubted that it had started an important conversation. Regina Hayes, meanwhile, handled the entire situation with a calm dignity that only added to her growing reputation. Despite the media frenzy surrounding the fine and the judge's public apology, Regina remained focused on the bigger picture. Her response to the judge's apology was measured, but there was an unmistakable strength in her words. In interviews, she graciously accepted the apology, but made it clear that her commitment to reform was unchanged. "I appreciate the judge's acknowledgement of his mistake," Regina said in one of her first public statements after the press conference. "But I think it's important to remember that this conversation isn't just about me. It's about the system that we all work within and the ways it can sometimes miss the mark. My work isn't about getting a personal apology. It's about ensuring the law is equitable for everyone." Her words resonated deeply with those who had followed her career. While the apology from the judge was a necessary step, it was clear that Regina had a broader vision in mind. She wasn't interested in being treated as a special case. She was focused on ensuring that the legal system worked fairly for everyone. Her focus remained on the policies she had worked so hard to revise, the ones that aimed to eliminate bias, ensure fairness, and create a more just legal environment for all people. Yet, Regina's response to the situation wasn't just about policy, it was about grace under pressure. In the face of a public spectacle that could have been seen as a personal affront, she chose not to dwell on the misstep of the judge, but instead used the moment as a platform to further her mission. She made it clear that the real work was not in retribution or blame, but in progress. Her calm composure and unwavering commitment to justice made her an even more powerful figure in the eyes of the public. I've been in this system long enough to know that change doesn't come from one decision or one apology, Regina continued in her interviews. It's a long, complicated process that requires patience, persistence, and most importantly, the courage to challenge what's wrong, even when it's difficult. As the media coverage of the situation began to wind down, it became clear that Regina Hayes had emerged from it stronger, with an even more solidified position as a leader in legal reform. The judge's apology had opened a door, but it was Regina who continued to walk through it with grace, humility, and an unwavering dedication to the work that mattered most to her. The public was now watching not only Regina's journey, but Judge Calloway's as well. His apology had been a step in the right direction, but it was clear that real change required more than just words. It required action. Regina's steadfast commitment to her mission had set the tone for what was to come. And for both of them, this moment was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about fairness, equality, and justice in the legal system. In the weeks following the press conference, the legal world and the public at large watched closely as both Judge Calloway and Regina Hayes continued to navigate the fallout from the incident. The judge, despite his earlier actions, found himself reevaluating his approach to justice. He sought advice from colleagues, read more of Regina's work, and even attended seminars on systemic inequality and criminal justice reform. He realized that it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the complexities of the people who were affected by it. He had been so wrapped up in the mechanics of the courtroom that he had failed to see the human stories that lay behind every case. Judge Calloway began making small but significant changes in his courtroom. He encouraged more community involvement in legal proceedings, inviting local activists and reform groups to speak with defendants before sentencing, and he took extra care in considering the circumstances that might not be immediately apparent on paper. He started recognizing patterns of inequality in cases that he had once dismissed, looking for ways to create more equitable outcomes. While these shifts weren't instant or without challenges, they marked the beginning of a more open-minded, compassionate approach to his role. Meanwhile, Regina Hayes remained steadfast in her mission. The attention from the incident had only amplified her platform, but rather than basking in the spotlight, she channeled it back into her work. She met with lawmakers, held roundtables with fellow legal professionals, and continued advocating for policies that addressed the deep flaws in the justice system. Regina didn't shy away from the controversy of the situation. Instead, she used it as a stepping stone to engage in more direct conversations about reform. Her influence in the legal community grew exponentially, as people began to see her not just as a policy expert, but as a symbol of resilience and vision for change. The relationship between the judge and Regina, though still largely professional, took on a new dynamic. They began to exchange letters from time to time, discussing legal matters, policies, and the broader implications of justice reform. Regina offered her perspective on certain issues, and Judge Calloway shared his experiences as a judge trying to implement changes in a system resistant to reform. Their correspondence became a meeting of minds, a shared effort to push the boundaries of what justice could and should be. One afternoon, Regina found herself back in the courthouse, but this time it wasn't as a defendant. She had been invited by Judge Calloway to give a guest lecture to a group of law students about the intersection of policy, justice, and fairness. As she walked into the room, she glanced over at the judge, sitting quietly at the back of the classroom. There was no tension between them now, only mutual respect. "Good afternoon, everyone," Regina began, her voice clear and confident. Today, I'm going to talk about the importance of understanding the law in context, why it's so critical to not just apply the law, but to ask the question, does it serve justice? As she spoke, she noticed Judge Calloway nodding in approval. The room was full of eager students, many of whom had followed her journey from the headlines. Regina smiled, knowing that the conversation had moved far beyond the confines of the courtroom. For the first time, it wasn't just about changing one person's perspective. It was about changing the system itself, piece by piece, day by day. And in that moment, Regina Hayes knew that the journey was far from over. But with people like Judge Calloway, willing to learn and adapt, perhaps the system could evolve after all. The future of justice was no longer just a concept in her mind. It was a shared vision, one that would shape the legal landscape for years to come.